Hello everyone, and welcome to the third installment in the series of Unmatched Advanced Fundamentals. Today we are talking about advantage, meaning maps and position, and we are talking about drafting in general, as well as a little bit of focus on conquest style drafting, as well as arsenal style drafting. You must understand that there is more than one path to the top of the mountain. This brilliant quote by Musashi Miyamoto is what I want you to keep in mind throughout this video. I cannot, nor do I wish to, show you every single way you can create an advantage throughout drafting and using your map or position to win the game. It would simply take ages, and I do not know all of them, and I do not wish to try and give you knowledge that would be incorrect. Instead, I will showcase you general trends, general ideas, of how I approach drafting and how you can approach drafting to create an advantage, and how to look for different advantages that I may not have found myself. Before we can talk about more complex concepts, let's first define advantage in Unmatched. Generally, you're going to be playing with split advantage, which means one player gets to choose the map, and the other player gets to choose which starting position they want on the map. Most of the time, player choosing position will also have one or two or maybe even more than two map bands before map is selected. When choosing the map, you want to choose a map which either plays towards the strengths of your fighter. For example, Tomoe Gozen really likes maps with aggressive zone cutoffs, where she can move you in and out of her zone easily to deal damage with her passive ability. You might want to play around your weaknesses, meaning if you are playing a more passive fighter, you might want a large map, or you might want to camp items, for example, to give you that bit of additional boost while you're on the defense. But you always want to tailor towards the matchup. For example, you might be playing a tempo fighter, but your opponent might be playing an even more aggressive tempo fighter, in which case you will take the role of the defensive party, and in that matchup you might take a larger map, so they have to boost more to approach you, or you might take a corridor map, which I will explain later, so you can body block your opponent when they're trying to reach you, even though your pick in a vacuum might not love that map. What you're doing is you are finding your weakness in the specific matchup, you are finding their strengths and your own strengths in the specific matchup, and then picking a map that will play around your weaknesses, enable your strengths, without enabling your opponent's strengths, and with abusing their weaknesses if possible. When picking position, the choice you are making is who starts with initiative. When you're in doubt, just choose to go first, because usually it's gonna be the correct choice. It's usually gonna be better, and even if it's worse, it's not gonna be as bad as choosing to go second when you should be going first. However, on the right we have a She-Hulk card, just to remind us that, for example, She-Hulk almost always wants to go second, so she has more cards in deck, and she can double maneuver more, and she can force initiative on their opponent to hit them with her passive, and to be the one who's counter-pressuring instead of pressuring. While I would love to cover every map in the game individually, it would take an incredible amount of time, but also the video would quickly get outdated, as each new set comes with at least one new additional map. So instead, what I will do is split maps into categories, and most maps will overlap, meaning most maps will feature more than just one category, but I will be keeping it simple with as few categories as I can manage, and then I will explain when you might want to draft these and when you might not. So the first category is small maps. These are maps which have a center space you can use as a move 4 or lower center. What this means is, no matter where the opposing fighter is on the map, if you take center space, you can come adjacent to them with 4 movement or less. So these maps are really good for aggressive fighters, even if they might be quite wide from edge to edge, corner to corner, however you want to call it. They allow you to take a turn regrouping, which I have covered in the last video, to take back the center space, and then next turn you can always reach. And some of these maps are quite small from corner to corner as well, meaning you can very often maneuver boost and reach your opponent nearly every turn of the game. So do not get confused by a map's physical proportions. For example, we have Point Pleasant here, which is quite a large map in physical space. However, it's very good for aggressive fighters because it is both a move force center map and it also has a Robin Hood space in the 5th player starting space, meaning that a ranged fighter in the center of the map can just take a single move 2 maneuver and reach any of the map's zones. The next category of maps is corridor maps, which are maps that feature long linear hallways, which you can use either to pin your opponent or to body block your opponent. So these maps are a bit of a double-edged sword because you will often use them defensively, right? By limiting your opponent's ability to either attack your hero or your sidekick, depending on who you're protecting. However, they can easily turn against you if you fail to body block crucial spaces and then your opponent gets a pin on you. Ranged maps often feature large zones, and some of them have the aforementioned Robin Hood spaces, which are range centers that allow you to reach any zone with just 2 movement. What you have to be very careful about is whether you're move 2 or move 3 ranged, because some maps feature range centers which are move 3. For example, Bronze, featured in the bottom left, which are amazing for fighters like Genie, but not nearly as good for fighters like Robin Hood or Tesla. If you're a move 3 fighter against a move 2 ranged fighter, you might want a ranged map, even if you're the defensive party, but a ranged map which caters to move 3 fighters and not move 2 fighters. So there's things like Memorial, which is a decent example of it. And then you can have more control over when you get to attack. Well, they might have to boost more often, and then that gives you some advantage which you can use defensively or even offensively. And sometimes, even though you're a ranged fighter, you might be fighting a way more aggressive ranged fighter. So for example, I often play Blackbeard quite defensively, and then if I'm against, for example, Tesla, who is way more aggressive of a ranged fighter, I might just decide to not take a ranged map and instead take an anti-ranged map so I can really force him to waste cards boosting and killing my sidekicks before he can aggress on me. So talking about anti-ranged maps, these maps are generally maps that have small zones with aggressive cutoffs. I call them anti-ranged, but Tomoe Gozen can really abuse some of these maps, especially against other ranged fighters. And here we have quite a few different ones. We have, for example, the Azuchi Castle on the top right, featured again with its small zones. Then on the top left we have McMinnville, which is a rather large map, but it has small zones. So move 3 melee fighters especially will enjoy this map against range fighters more than anything else. But also you can use it with melee v melee, for example. Bigfoot likes small zones, so he can trigger his ability, whereas Little Red likes large zones, so she can use her damage scheme to hit multiple opponents. So if you're playing Bigfoot against Little Red, this is one of the maps you might want to take. We have Heorot with the Doors, which is a nightmare for ranged fighters, but it can also be used as a very powerful map when you're a move 3 fighter fighting a move 2 fighter, because you get to open more doors throughout the game and then you get to close more doors in their face, and especially if you're a defensive one, you'll be opening doors less than they are, and then this single map can stretch the movement advantage by an incredible margin. And then the least specific category are gimmick maps. I'm going to group them all together, even though, to be honest, every single map gimmick could be its own video, but this isn't the point of advanced fundamentals. So gimmick maps allow you to do many different things. The first one is to punish initiative. So if you're playing a fighter like Golden Bat, you might run through hidden passageways, or you may camp +2 item tokens, which will really stretch out your weaker defenses and make you nearly unkillable. They also reward fighters that have powerful map control tools. So for example, Yanenga, who has 2 sidekicks, both of which aren't single health, so they're a bit harder to kill off, Or like Engine, who has a bunch of sidekicks and sidekick respawns and trap tokens. They can just control the map better than most fighters, meaning they can cover multiple tokens or multiple very critical connections or spaces at the same time, allowing them to take better control of gimmick maps than most other fighters. Gimmick maps always, no matter what the gimmick is, they always reward fighters with movement effects. So Leonardo has the King movement effect. His passive allows him to move a fighter at the start of every turn for completely free, meaning that you never want to face him on a gimmick map if you can stop it, because he will move you off of items, he will move himself towards items, he will get you off of high ground, and then he'll get himself on high ground and deal you additional damage. He can move himself or you through hidden passageways and so on. So whatever you do, he can abuse it. Tomoe Gozen has a bunch of built-in movement effects, and then she can just, again, move you off of items, or if you're on the versatile +1/+2 items, she can force you to use them suboptimally because she threatens moving you. Then there's Loki. Loki can just walk. He has like one of the coolest things in the game where he can walk onto a +2 item token. He can just chill on it for the rest of the turn, and then next turn he can use his scheme to teleport you next to him, and then he can attack with a +2 on Ragnarok. But since Ragnarok cannot be cancelled, you cannot use your cancel to remove the item token from his attack, meaning he guarantees the +2. You also have Pandora here, for example. I did this in a tournament setting once where Yanenga was camping a +2 item. I used Zeus to move her one space off of the item, and then I used the teleport to get on the +2 item and give myself additional damage against a fighter who cannot use cancels, because Yanenga doesn't have any cancels. So another thing gimmick maps can do is they can supplement your exhaustion, meaning you can use tokens, the scheme tokens especially, as passes. And this way you can either turn a fighter that's bad into exhaustion into a fighter that's decent in exhaustion, or as an exhaustion-based fighter, you can make it so that your opponent can never get the upper hand in deck count. And then you can just do silly combos. For example, the silliest combo I can think of, and I always use this example, is Geralt on Helicarrier. You just play your scheme, which says if an effect would make you discard cards from your hand, you can choose to ignore it. You can choose to ignore the discards. Do this on Helicarrier, and then play the Helicarrier item scheme, which makes all players discard 2 cards, which is absolutely incredible, and it can make very difficult matchups way more manageable. Now that we've covered the basics of maps, and now that we've explained the basics of Advantage, we shall transition slowly to drafting. So to begin this transition, let's talk about general drafting advice, or general draft advice. First of all, at the beginning of any draft, you will know which format you're playing and which fighter pool and map pool, or fighter roster and map roster, the format is based on. So it might be open roster or open format, where all fighters and all maps are legal. It might be limited by sets, for example, no IP sets, only public domain sets. It might be limited by when the set came out. It might be limited by regional availability, or it might just be a custom format where the organizers either chose or polled what the players want and then created a custom format with a limited pool of fighters and a limited pool of maps. So what I like to start with is identifying what I call power picks. Power picks are what I consider the most powerful fighters which are legal for the tournament, especially in a vacuum. So if I'm seeing someone like Sherlock Holmes, if I'm seeing Elektra, Doctor Strange, Medusa, I'm going to keep a mental note on these fighters, and I'm going to look whether I have to pick them, I have to counter them, ban them, etc., etc. Or maybe even if the pool is designed specifically to counter these fighters, then I have to consider if they're like a trap pick. So after I identify the power picks, I analyze and I apply available maps. So I might have like a pool of 6 or 7 best fighters, and then I'll think about, okay, how do the maps make some of these fighters better or worse, and how does that reflect on my draft? Then I will go towards understanding leader and follower roles. So what advantage does leader have over the follower? What advantage, if any, the follower has over the leader? And then I'll try and have a general idea of how I want the draft to go both as leader and as follower. While thinking about this, I will always know my own comfort picks, and I advise you to do the same. The fighters you are very comfortable with and you believe you can overperform with even in sub-ideal circumstances. So knowing these will also allow you to slightly tweak the draft and get an additional surprise factor or additional advantage inside of the draft, knowing that, well, maybe Loki isn't the best fighter here, but I'm very comfortable with Loki even in his worst matchups, or I like my 40-60 Loki matchups, so I'm fine first picking him here, and then having these trends, knowing what you're more comfortable with, will allow you to shape the draft taking that into consideration. And then, before starting your match, you want to scout your opponent. What are their comfort picks? What do they try to force in the first round, second round of draft, whatever? And then you know what you want to counterpick, what you want to ban, and so on based on their preferences. Now we can move towards format-specific advice for drafting. To keep it simple, as well as keeping it relatively immune to the varies of time, I will only define two draft styles in this video, which are going to be the two most popular ones. So I'm going to be talking about Arsenal style drafts, where both players are going to be blind picking a set of fighters, banning the mirrors, and then continuing for multiple rounds until both players have a unique roster of fighters that they are going to be playing with. 4-pick Arsenal, 5-pick Arsenal, Barsenal, and many other sub-formats will be falling under the umbrella term of Arsenal for this video. Conquest-style drafts, where leader is, well, there's generally going to first be a ban phase where leader bans one, follower bans one, then leader, then back to follower, and then players are going to be picking fighters. Most often, leader picks one, then follower picks two, then leader picks two, and so on. Or sometimes it's just going to be leader one, leader one, follower one, and so on. So things like Banquest, which is very popular and my favorite format, and other Conquest variants are going to fall under the umbrella of Conquest for this video. The main difference between the two is that Arsenal is more chaotic because you're picking with more hidden information and picking simultaneously, while Conquest tends to give you more control over the draft, it tends to be more orderly, and you tend to pick with more open information. So in Arsenal, you really want to contest the power picks. Let's say you're playing in a limited pool and you've identified the 6 most powerful fighters, and then 4 out of those 6, they seem a slightly bit better than the other 2. So you really want to get those picks in early. You either want to mirror them to ban them out so your opponent doesn't have them, or you want to get them for yourself. One thing you can do in Arsenal is you can sneak in comfortable counter picks. So let's say you're thinking about those first 4, but maybe one of the other 2 is really good into 2 of the first 4, and then you're way more comfortable with it, and you think it's harder to counter later on down the line. You might even sneak in like a quote-unquote weaker pick in round 1, and then try and get as many counters for the pick you're leaving open. However, generally you're going to start sneaking in weaker picks from round 2 onwards, maybe even only round 3 onwards, because you can always try and sneak in a fighter just to try and guarantee them for yourself, but there's always an opportunity cost because then you're allowing your opponent to get what is considered a more contested pick. What you have to watch out for in Arsenal is to not overcommit to counters, because until the entire draft is over, you won't know all of your opponent's fighters. So by trying to focus on countering his stuff, you might leave yourself open to other counters, and then he might even self-ban the fighter, or he might just take an L and then win the other games. So you really want to understand that Arsenal favors power in a vacuum and really wide positive matchup spreads, and you really don't want to overcommit to countering because it will often just backfire. For Conquest, you also always want to contest the power picks, but the way you do it is slightly different. So let's say the Conquest variant you're playing has 6 bands, and then leader drafts first, and then follower takes 2 drafts, and then leader 2 drafts, and so on. So as follower, you want either 0, 2, or 3 power picks getting through. Because if there's no power picks, no one gets any. If there's 2, your opponent gets 1, you get 1, and that's fine, but it might not be ideal. But the best case scenario is 3 power picks getting through the ban phase. Because then leader will pick 1, you'll pick 2, and then you can either target counter his power pick or ban it, but he will have to play against one of your power picks. While as leader, you either want there to be exactly 1 power pick making it through the ban phase, because you can guarantee it for yourself, or you want none, in which case, again, you're just going to be playing without the power picks, and you won't have to worry about your opponent gaining access to more power picks than you have. In Conquest, you can always try to counterpick your opponent's last pick, which I'm not saying it's the best idea, it's just something that the format allows, meaning that it favors counterpicking, which also means that you have to pick in a way where it's harder to counterpick you. If you get all melee fighters and then your opponent gets engine, I mean, sorry, but you're taking an L there. To avoid this issue, you want to start with your so-called blind picks, which are picks that are really good with low information, so the same picks that would be favored in Arsenal. So that's your power picks, but also you can go a bit weird with these generalist fighters, like, let's say Loki, for example, who have a lot of these 40-60 matchups, but you might be fine playing them because you have a lot of experience on the fighter. And then you want to taper your draft towards specific specialist picks as the draft goes on, find encounters that ideally hit either your opponent's entire roster of fighters or most of them. And then, so you want to have this clear transition of good blind picks towards specialist picks. And this means that Conquest is way more orderly, it means you have more information, and it's just a different experience from Arsenal, but both of them have their own advantages and disadvantages, which you really have to understand in order to gain a competitive edge. What will not get you the competitive edge is falling for draft traps. So I will be covering the most common draft traps here. So the first one I call being countered by circles. So there's many, especially tempo or aggro fighters, who are just countered by the number of circles that are drawn on the table. So they're countered by the number of spaces on the map. There's Raphael, there's Achilles, there's also Donatello, there's T-Rex. These fighters generally want smaller maps. And drafting one of these is generally fine because you can often guarantee a map for them in the draft. However, drafting multiples of these is generally very bad because then you are almost guaranteeing yourself a loss when your opponent gets map advantage. You also don't want to get full countered, so here I have Wukong and Injun as some of the most notorious counter picks in the game, just because both of them tend to counter almost all melee fighters in the game. But there's also Raptors and there's also Daredevil, which are fighters that tend to have relatively polarized matchup spreads, and then if your whole lineup is just fighters that are bad into them, you're gonna get obliterated by them. And I'm not saying that Raptor and Daredevil matchup spreads completely overlap, they do not. But they're just examples of really decent fighters that are exceptional counter picks. You have to watch out to not overvalue or undervalue power picks. So all of the very powerful fighters in the game do have their counters, but if you leave Sherlock Holmes open, what are you going to pick into them? You can go like maybe Yenenga. You might find like Raptors as a really, really good powerful counter pick. You might take Sinbad as a 40-60. But then what happens if your opponent just drafts better? Sure, you get to counter one of his picks, but your draft in its integrity, holistically speaking, is way weaker than your opponent's, so you want to avoid that situation. So that would be undervaluing a power pick. You don't want to allow your opponent to get those for free. But there's also overvaluing them when, let's say, your opponent does get 4 counters for Sherlock. You don't want to just play the Sherlock. You want to self-ban it. You want to beat your opponent with the rest of your draft being just a higher quality than his or her. And then there's also the trap of fearing 40-60 matchups. So I like my drafts to be low volatility, meaning I really want to avoid these swingy 30-70 matchups ever coming up. And if that means taking, like, biting a bullet on playing all 40-60s, I'm generally going to be fine with that. Like, don't fear 40-60 matchups as if they were the end of the world. Don't fear any matchups. Like, draft against those matchups, but if you have to play at 20-80, like, do your best, you might still win it. And then there's the issue of gifting full advantage. So I mentioned how powerful full advantage is. It had to be cut out from unmatched because it was too strong. And then if you're playing against, let's say, Donatello, and you're playing a fighter that can, like, decently play exhaustion, at least compared to Donatello, but you still take a move 4 map, you're shooting yourself in the foot to run faster. Like, don't do that. If your opponent really wants a specific map type or a specific position, and you have the choice, don't give them what they want. Fight against it. And then the last thing for this video is I'm going to make an example way of how I view a fighter pool and a map pool and how that allows you to draft well. So here's an example of a hero and map pool or a fighter and map pool for Unmatched AJ League Volume 7, which I'm currently playing at the time of recording this video. So at first glance, what I'm going to look for is whatever I might consider the power picks. So these 6, with the top 4 being the most powerful, not in any particular order, and then the next 2 being the second most powerful, is what I'm considering the power picks. So looking at these, I think the top 4 are ever so slightly more powerful in a vacuum. However, I will often just go for Shredder and Yanenga because I prefer them over, let's say, Aridin and Raphael. There are multiple paths to victory. You don't always have to mathematically choose whatever's the objectively strongest. Go with what you prefer, what you think is going to make you win, okay? And then once we have this map of the most contested or most powerful fighters, let's apply the maps to it. In this map pool, you can ban out all maps which are larger than a move 4 center, meaning you can force move 4 center maps, and you also cannot ban out item maps. You have to leave at least one legal. So the first point, for example, is very bad for Shredder, because Shredder wants to create a gap between him and the opponent. He wants to play a slower value game before he sets up his combo. But the second one is really good for him, because you can always take a item map and neutralize some of the damage you would be receiving on like a normal map. I'm just taking Shredder as an example because I'm very comfortable with the fighter, but you could also apply these on Golden Bat, for example. So Golden Bat also wants a large map where he can just exhaust you, but he also really likes item maps. So this perception is somewhat Golden Bat neutral, let's say. It's quite Raphael positive because you can ban out the move 5 maps and then try to force your opponent to give you full advantage because you get a map you like and you also get to go first. These are the things we really look for when determining what fighters we want to contest. And then having applied these maps and having applied these fighters and thinking about, okay, which ones get banned and which ones get picked, we can also start to add some picks we think will shine. So picks like Tesla and Annie Christmas are going to be good into some of these 6 top fighters. Picks like, well, Bruce Lee isn't ever going to be like the most dominant pick, but if you're really a Bruce Lee fan and you're really good at him, you can try and like force him here because he's decent into Yanenga, he's good into Raphael, so you can look for, he's good into Shredder, so you can look for opportunities to play him if you want to. And then you can use these maps and you can, for example, you can take into consideration that there are item maps and also move 4 center maps. And you can take Little Red, who likes small maps and has a lot of map control with her Huntsman. And you can see she likes this pool. She also has a shot into quite a number of these powerful fighters. And then you can sort of expand the pool from the 6 power picks into what are your next picks. What are you contesting if the top 6 are either banned out or after they're picked. And there's like, for example, Donatello again, because of the move 4 centers, you can force full advantage when your opponent gets mapped. stuff like that. So think about these things and then shape your draft towards a very solid, very stable thing. So in Arsenal, you're generally gonna be pick banning the first six, and then you might be looking into the next six with maybe a few matchups of your own preference. There's gonna be Raptors and Genie, like quite early on. Moon Knight very early on as well. And if you're playing conquest style draft, on the other hand, you're gonna think of, okay, can I secure two of these six for myself as follower? If not, let's ban them all out. Can I get exactly one of them as leader? If not, maybe you want to ban them all out. Maybe you want to leave multiple open because you have specific counterpick ideas. And then you're going to be looking at these next six, or maybe not Bruce Lee, maybe like Moon Knight or Raptors or Genie. And then you're going to slowly start to taper off. You might even look at like early Black Widow as a sort of generalist pick, and then you're going to slowly taper off towards your slightly weaker fighters who might just be good into your opponent's draft. Let's say Pandora, let's say Titania. These really good fighters that are just slightly under the ones you will contest early. And then you will also look for if there's fighters that you can use as sorry, not bans, but counters. There's gonna be like Engine is a really good one. There might be Leonardo. So there might be Krang for anti-aggression. And this is how you're gonna generally want to draft. So divide it into steps of how you analyze, and then analyze first. And after analyzing, after already having the answers, the draft will be way easier. Do that. Also, if you enjoyed the video, if it helped you, first of all, let me know. Like, write in the comments if any of these videos allowed you to win games you maybe wouldn't have won without the videos. And also don't forget to do all of the classic liking, sharing, subscribing. It really helps the channel grow. It really helps support it with newcomers, with additional views. And that allows us all to grow the community, and it allows even more people to have access to these resources. Thank you so much, and thank you again for all of the community support being so awesome. See you next time.